At 0014, USS Indianapolis was struck by two Japanese torpedoes. The explosions ripped through the cruiser almost instantly. Power failed across the ship. Men were thrown from bunks into darkness, smoke, and burning fuel before they understood what had happened. Below deck, entire compartments began flooding within seconds. There was no time to organize evacuation, no time to prepare lifeboats, and no nearby ships coming to help. 12 minutes later, USS Indianapolis disappeared beneath the Pacific Ocean. Nearly 900 men survived the sinking. At first, many believed rescue ships would arrive by sunrise. They were wrong. No distress response came. No search operation began. And for the next 4 days, hundreds of sailors drifted alone in open water beneath the Pacific sun. Some died from dehydration, others disappeared during the night. Survivors later recalled hearing screams in the darkness as sharks moved between scattered groups of men floating across the water. Because after USS Indianapolis went down, almost nobody knew the ship was missing. In the summer of 1945, USS Indianapolis operated under conditions unlike almost any other vessel in the Pacific Fleet. Its mission orders were classified beyond standard naval security protocols. Even among senior officers aboard the ship, only a small number understood the importance of the cargo loaded before departure. Most of the crew knew only that the cruiser had been reassigned to a high-priority transport operation requiring maximum speed and minimum disclosure. The ship departed San Francisco carrying components tied to a project few Americans had even heard of. Locked inside guarded containers were critical parts later used in the first atomic bomb deployed in warfare. Armed Marines monitored the cargo continuously during transit. Access was restricted. Questions were discouraged. The urgency surrounding the mission altered normal operational procedure from the beginning. Indianapolis did not travel as part of a larger formation. There were no escort destroyers screening for submarines. No protective anti-submarine perimeter surrounded the cruiser as it crossed the Pacific at high speed. The Navy considered the route relatively secure compared to earlier phases of the war. Japanese naval power had been heavily reduced. American commanders increasingly believed large-scale threats in the region were collapsing under sustained Allied pressure. That assumption shaped nearly every decision that followed. The voyage initially appeared uneventful. Indianapolis maintained rapid transit across open water, stopping briefly at Pearl Harbor before continuing westward. Crew members later recalled that morale aboard the ship had improved during the operation. Rumors circulated that Japan was nearing defeat. Some believed the war itself could end within months. For many aboard, the mission felt safer than previous combat deployments. The ship had already survived some of the largest naval operations of the Pacific War. Indianapolis had participated in bombardments across multiple island campaigns and previously survived a kamikaze strike near Okinawa. Compared to those experiences, this assignment seemed routine, fast, secretive, but far from the direct violence that had defined earlier operations. That perception deepened after the cruiser successfully completed delivery of its classified cargo to Tinian Island. The guarded containers were unloaded under tight security and transferred inland almost immediately. Few sailors understood what they had transported. Fewer still realized how close they had come to one of the most consequential military operations in modern history. With the delivery complete, Indianapolis received new orders. The cruiser was instructed to proceed toward the Philippines to prepare for future operations connected to the planned invasion of mainland Japan. The route would take the ship through waters where isolated Japanese submarines were still active, though American naval intelligence increasingly viewed them as limited threats incapable of significantly altering the course of the war. That confidence would prove dangerous. On July 28th, Indianapolis departed Guam and began moving west across the Philippine Sea. Captain Charles McVeigh commanded the vessel under standard wartime conditions, but several unusual circumstances shaped the voyage from the start. No destroyer escort was assigned to accompany the cruiser. Requests regarding submarine intelligence in the area produced incomplete information. Existing reports underestimated Japanese submarine activity along the projected route. Even basic operational precautions became inconsistent. Under certain conditions, Navy doctrine encouraged zigzag maneuvering to complicate enemy torpedo targeting. But zigzag patterns were not always maintained continuously, particularly during periods of reduced visibility or when commanders judged submarine threats to be minimal. Weather conditions and visibility varied as Indianapolis advanced across open water. Crew routines resumed. Watches rotated normally. Many sailors believed the most dangerous phase of the voyage had already passed. Below deck, daily life settled into familiar rhythm. Mess halls operated on schedule. Maintenance crews handled routine repairs. Some sailors wrote letters home. Others slept through the humid nights beneath the cruiser's armored decks, unaware that Japanese submarine I-58 had already entered the region ahead of them. Commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto, the submarine remained one of the few operational Japanese attack submarines still conducting patrols in the area. Unlike much of the shattered Imperial fleet, isolated submarine crews could still operate independently across vast stretches of ocean. Resources were limited, fuel shortages were severe, and Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated dramatically, but submarines still retained the ability to inflict catastrophic damage under the right conditions. And in the darkness ahead of Indianapolis, I-58 began detecting movement across the water. At first, the contact appeared distant, but as the submarine adjusted course, the outline of a large vessel gradually became visible against the night horizon. Shortly after midnight on July 30th, USS Indianapolis continued west across the Philippine Sea under relatively calm conditions. Visibility fluctuated throughout the night. Cloud cover moved intermittently across the sky, reducing moonlight and limiting long-range observation from the bridge. Inside the cruiser, much of the crew had already settled into standard nighttime routine. Off-duty sailors slept below deck while rotating watch teams monitored the surrounding ocean from observation points positioned across the ship. Few aboard believed immediate danger was likely. For most of 1945, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively toward the United States. Major Japanese surface fleets had been destroyed or isolated. American commanders increasingly viewed scattered submarine activity as a secondary threat compared to earlier phases of the war. Even along contested routes, many crews no longer operated with the same level of constant tension that had defined the brutal naval campaigns of 1942 and 1943. But several hundred miles away, Japanese submarine I-58 had already altered course. Commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto, the submarine had been patrolling the area under increasingly desperate wartime conditions. Japan's strategic position was collapsing across nearly every front. Fuel shortages restricted naval mobility. Air superiority had been lost. American bombing raids intensified against the Japanese mainland almost daily. Yet isolated submarines still represented one of the few remaining tools capable of inflicting sudden damage against Allied naval traffic. Earlier that night, lookouts aboard I-58 identified movement against the horizon. At first, the contact appeared uncertain, but as the submarine maneuvered into position, the outline of a large warship became increasingly visible through gaps in the darkness. Hashimoto later recalled recognizing the target as a heavy cruiser moving independently without escort protection. For the submarine crew, the opportunity was significant. Indianapolis remained unaware that it was being tracked. Aboard the cruiser, operational routine continued normally. Engine systems maintained steady transit speed while bridge personnel monitored course progression toward the Philippines. Some officers remained alert for submarine risk, but prevailing assumptions regarding reduced Japanese naval capability shaped overall threat perception across much of the voyage. Then, shortly after midnight, Hashimoto gave the order to fire. Torpedoes launched from I-58 cut through the water toward the cruiser's starboard side. Moments later, the first impact struck forward sections of the ship with devastating force. The explosion tore through the bow area and triggered immediate structural damage across multiple compartments. Almost simultaneously, a second torpedo impacted near critical engineering sections farther aft. The combined effect crippled electrical systems and rapidly compromised internal stability throughout the vessel. The transformation aboard Indianapolis was immediate. Lights failed across large sections of the ship. Smoke and burning fuel spread through damaged corridors. Men sleeping below deck were thrown violently from bunks as the cruiser shuddered under the force of the explosions. In several compartments, flooding began so rapidly that sailors became trapped before escape routes could be organized. Confusion spread almost instantly. Communication systems malfunctioned as officers attempted to assess the scale of damage. Survivors later described conditions below deck as chaotic and disorienting. Dark passageways filling with water, ruptured pipes releasing steam, and emergency instructions competing against the sound of collapsing internal structures. Above deck, the situation deteriorated just as quickly. The cruiser immediately began listing starboard as water poured into compromised sections of the hull. Crew members rushed toward life jackets and flotation gear while damage control teams attempted emergency response procedures. But the scale of flooding made stabilization increasingly impossible. Indianapolis had suffered catastrophic structural failure within minutes. Captain Charles McVeigh ordered abandonment preparations as sailors struggled to deploy available life-saving equipment under collapsing conditions. Some life rafts failed to release correctly. Others drifted away amid the confusion. Fuel leaking from ruptured tanks spread across surrounding water while debris from the explosion scattered across the surface nearby. The speed of the sinking shocked even experienced crew members. Many had expected the cruiser to remain afloat long enough for organized evacuation. Instead, the list increased rapidly as the bow dropped deeper into the water. Men jumped overboard to avoid being pulled beneath the ship as internal compartments continued flooding uncontrollably. Then the stern began rising. Survivors watching from the water later described the final moments as sudden and violent. The massive cruiser tilted sharply before disappearing beneath the Pacific, dragging wreckage, equipment, and trapped sailors down with it. 12 minutes after the torpedoes struck, USS Indianapolis was gone. Nearly 900 men remained alive in the water, and almost all of them still believed rescue was already on the way. For the first several minutes after USS Indianapolis disappeared beneath the surface, many survivors remained convinced the situation was temporary. The cruiser had been operating on an active wartime route. Hundreds of sailors had entered the water carrying life jackets or clinging to floating debris. Officers attempted to regroup nearby men while scattered clusters of survivors drifted outward across the dark Pacific. Most assumed rescue ships would arrive within hours. That expectation shaped behavior almost immediately. Some sailors tried conserving energy, believing daylight would bring aircraft overhead or nearby naval units into the area. Others focused on locating injured crewmen floating nearby in the darkness. Calls for medical corpsmen echoed across the water while small groups attempted to organize themselves around floating nets, rafts, and scattered wreckage pulled beneath the surface only minutes earlier. But conditions surrounding the survivors deteriorated rapidly. Fuel leaking from Indianapolis spread across large sections of water around the sinking site. Many men had entered the ocean coated in oil from ruptured tanks and burning debris. Some suffered burns from the explosions themselves. Others carried broken bones, shrapnel wounds, or internal injuries sustained during the sinking. Medical treatment was almost non-existent. Supplies had gone down with the ship. Most survivors possessed only life jackets and whatever equipment they had managed to grab during the evacuation chaos. Several men floated without shoes or proper clothing after being thrown directly from sleeping quarters into the water. The darkness complicated everything. Groups became separated almost immediately as ocean currents gradually spread survivors farther apart. Voices remained audible across portions of the water during the first hours, but visibility stayed limited. Men repeatedly called out ship names, division numbers, and requests for help into the darkness, hoping nearby survivors would respond. Some never heard an answer. By early morning, exhaustion had already begun setting in. Many sailors had entered the water without time to fully secure life jackets. Others struggled to remain afloat while supporting injured shipmates beside them. Saltwater exposure burned eyes and open wounds continuously. Oil floating across the surface contaminated mouths and skin while survivors drifted beneath increasingly intense heat as daylight approached. Still, most remained convinced rescue was coming. Several officers attempted maintaining discipline within larger groups, encouraging men to stay together and avoid panic. Rumors spread that distress calls had certainly reached nearby commands before the cruiser sank. Some believed aircraft were already searching the area, but no rescue operation had begun. Unknown to the survivors, multiple communication failures and reporting errors prevented Indianapolis from being immediately identified as overdue. The ship's classified mission status complicated normal tracking procedures, while several transmitted warnings and movement reports had already been mishandled or ignored within separate command structures. In the water, none of the survivors understood this yet. As daylight fully emerged across the Pacific, the scale of the disaster became clearer. The ocean around them stretched endlessly in every direction. No ships appeared along the horizon, no aircraft crossed overhead. Debris floated between scattered groups of exhausted sailors while bodies from the sinking drifted silently nearby. The psychological effect intensified quickly. Men began asking officers when rescue would arrive. Some attempted calculating how long they had already remained in the water. Others focused entirely on immediate survival, rationing physical effort, adjusting flotation gear, or searching nearby debris for anything useful. The heat soon became relentless. Without fresh water, dehydration accelerated rapidly beneath the tropical sun. Salt exposure damaged skin and eyes, while prolonged floating weakened already exhausted survivors. Several sailors began drinking seawater despite warnings from others nearby. The effects appeared quickly. Confusion spread among some groups as dehydration and salt poisoning intensified. Conversations became disorganized. Men reported seeing ships or aircraft that were not there. Others insisted rescue vessels had already appeared along the horizon despite empty ocean surrounding them. As the first full day passed, confidence began collapsing. Questions replaced certainty. Why had nobody arrived? Why were there no aircraft? Why had no distress response appeared after an American heavy cruiser disappeared in open water? Then, sometime during the second night, survivors floating within scattered groups began noticing movement beneath the surface. At first, many assumed it was debris drifting through the water. Then the attacks started. The first shark attacks did not happen all at once. For many survivors, the danger appeared gradually: isolated movement beneath the water, brief disturbances near drifting bodies, sudden splashing somewhere beyond visible range in the darkness. During the early hours, several sailors convinced themselves the shapes circling nearby were harmless or temporary. That belief disappeared quickly. Survivors later described dorsal fins cutting through the water between scattered groups of men floating across the Pacific. Most attacks targeted isolated sailors positioned away from larger clusters. Exhausted men drifting alone or struggling to remain afloat became immediate targets. Then the screaming began. Panic spread unevenly across the water. Some groups attempted pulling closer together while others kicked violently beneath the surface in fear. Officers and senior sailors ordered men to remain calm, warning that unnecessary movement could attract more sharks into surrounding areas. But discipline became increasingly difficult to maintain. Many survivors had already entered severe dehydration by the second day. Lips cracked from salt exposure, tongues swelled, eyes burned continuously from oil and seawater. Heat exhaustion weakened concentration, while exhaustion reduced the ability to think clearly for long periods. The Pacific itself became an enemy. Under direct sunlight, floating conditions grew unbearable. Men drifted hour after hour beneath open sky with no protection from heat or exposure. Some attempted using scraps of debris for shade. Others simply floated silently, conserving what little strength remained. But the greatest danger increasingly came from psychological collapse. Hallucinations spread through multiple survivor groups as dehydration worsened. Sailors reported seeing ships on the horizon that vanished moments later. Some claimed they could hear music, engines, or voices from nearby rescue crews that did not exist. Others became convinced fresh water floated nearby beneath the ocean surface. Several men began drinking seawater despite repeated warnings. The consequences appeared rapidly. Those affected often became irrational within hours. Survivors later recalled men screaming incoherently, removing life jackets, or attempting to swim toward imagined ships visible only to them. In some cases, sailors drifted away from organized groups entirely, disappearing into open water during the night. Others simply stopped responding. As conditions deteriorated, floating groups became smaller and increasingly disorganized. Bodies remained visible across sections of the water as currents carried survivors farther apart. Conversations that had once centered around rescue gradually shifted toward survival itself, how long they could remain conscious, whether rain might come, and how many men were still alive nearby. The attacks continued intermittently. Sharks frequently targeted the dead first, but survivors later described repeated attacks against injured or isolated sailors unable to defend themselves. The unpredictability created constant tension across the water. At night, many survivors feared falling asleep entirely. Some never woke again. By the third day, physical deterioration became visible everywhere. Life jackets weakened from prolonged exposure, injuries became infected, burns worsened beneath constant sunlight. Several men drifted unconscious for long periods before dying quietly beside surviving shipmates who lacked strength to help them. And still no rescue ships arrived. For many survivors, that realization became more devastating than the attacks themselves. An American heavy cruiser carrying nearly 200 men had vanished during wartime operations in the Pacific. Yet nobody had come. Some officers attempted maintaining morale by insisting search aircraft would appear eventually. Others privately began recognizing the possibility that Indianapolis had not been reported missing at all. That possibility terrified them, because if the Navy did not know the cruiser was gone, survivors understood what it meant. No rescue force was searching nearby waters, no aircraft were tracking their location, and every additional hour in the Pacific reduced the number of men still capable of surviving. By the fourth day, many floating groups had nearly stopped speaking altogether. The ocean had become silent except for waves, distant cries, and occasional panic when another shark appeared near the surface. Then, sometime during the afternoon, several survivors noticed something above the horizon. At first, many assumed it was another hallucination, but this time the sound grew louder. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 4 days after USS Indianapolis sank, a routine patrol flight crossed above the Philippine Sea. The aircraft had not been dispatched to search for missing survivors. No large-scale rescue operation was underway. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, had been conducting standard anti-submarine patrol procedures when unusual movement below the aircraft caught his attention. At first, the shapes scattered across the water appeared difficult to identify against sunlight reflecting off the Pacific surface. Then the crew realized they were looking at men, hundreds of them. Floating debris stretched across large sections of ocean while survivors waved weakly toward the aircraft below. Oil slicks remained visible between scattered groups drifting far apart from one another. Bodies could be seen floating motionless among the living. Gwynn immediately recognized the scale of the disaster. The patrol aircraft circled lower as crew members transmitted emergency contact reports describing survivors spread across the water. Even from above, conditions appeared catastrophic. Many sailors were too weak to signal the aircraft at all. Others floated motionless beside debris fields created days earlier during the sinking. For the first time since Indianapolis disappeared, American command structures realized the cruiser was missing. The discovery triggered immediate confusion. Several naval officers receiving the transmission initially struggled to understand how a heavy cruiser carrying nearly 200 men could vanish without formal recognition for 4 days. Questions spread rapidly through communication centers as rescue coordination finally began. Nearby ships were redirected toward the area. Aircraft launched from surrounding bases. Emergency rescue procedures accelerated across multiple commands simultaneously. But for the survivors still floating in the Pacific, help remained dangerously far away. As rescue aircraft continued arriving overhead, many sailors lacked the strength to respond visibly. Severe dehydration, exposure, injuries, and psychological collapse had reduced survivors to scattered clusters barely capable of remaining conscious. Some drifted alone hundreds of meters from organized groups. Others floated beside dying shipmates they had spent days attempting to keep alive. One of the first aircraft to arrive after Gwyn's report was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks. What he saw below shocked him immediately. Marks later described survivors spread across the ocean in every direction, surrounded by debris, bodies, and drifting oil. Several men appeared close to death. Others were actively being attacked beneath the surface as rescue aircraft circled overhead. Standard protocol prohibited water landings under such conditions. Marks ignored the order. Understanding many survivors would die before ships could arrive, he landed his aircraft directly onto the open ocean despite dangerous surface conditions. The impact risked destroying the plane entirely, but the rescue attempt continued anyway. Crew members began pulling survivors aboard immediately. Space inside the aircraft disappeared within minutes. Additional sailors were tied across the wings using parachute cords because no room remained inside the fuselage. Injured men were dragged from the water while others clung desperately to floating debris nearby. Several survivors later recalled believing the aircraft itself looked unreal after days stranded beneath open sky. Still, rescue remained slow. The number of survivors vastly exceeded immediate evacuation capability. Destroyers and additional ships continued racing toward the area, but many remained hours away. Meanwhile, conditions in the water kept worsening. Some sailors died even after rescue aircraft arrived overhead. Others lacked strength to climb aboard flotation devices lowered from above. Several survivors became disoriented during rescue attempts themselves, struggling to understand whether what they were seeing was real after days of dehydration and hallucinations. As night approached, the first rescue ships finally entered the area. Searchlights swept across the Pacific while crews hauled exhausted survivors aboard one after another. Many sailors collapsed immediately after reaching deck surfaces for the first time in days. Others required emergency medical treatment before they could even speak. The scale of loss gradually became impossible to ignore. Nearly 200 men had departed aboard USS Indianapolis. Only a fraction remained alive when rescue operations finally reached them. And inside Navy command structures, a far more dangerous question was beginning to emerge. How had nobody realized the ship was gone? As survivors recovered aboard rescue ships and medical stations across the Pacific, investigators inside the United States Navy began reconstructing the final movements of USS Indianapolis. What they discovered exposed a chain of failures stretching across multiple commands. The cruiser had not vanished because rescue forces were delayed by weather, distance, or enemy interference. For 4 days, almost nobody had realized the ship was missing. That fact alone stunned naval officers reviewing the disaster. Under normal wartime procedure, movement reports tracked major vessels operating between Pacific bases. Arrival times, communication updates, and route confirmations helped commands monitor fleet positioning across enormous stretches of ocean. But Indianapolis operated under unusual conditions from the beginning. Its previous mission delivering atomic bomb components remained highly classified. Certain operational details had been restricted even within naval command structures. After departing Guam, the cruiser's movement information passed through multiple administrative systems, already strained by the scale of Pacific operations in late 1945. Some reports were incomplete, others were ignored entirely. One transmitted message indicating Indianapolis had failed to arrive on schedule was reportedly mishandled by officers who assumed delays were operational rather than catastrophic. In another case, warnings regarding submarine activity near the cruiser's projected route never reached Captain Charles McVeigh in full detail before departure. No single mistake caused the disaster. Instead, small failures accumulated until the ship effectively disappeared inside the Navy's own wartime bureaucracy. The consequences became deadly. When Indianapolis failed to report arrival, no immediate emergency search began. Some officers believed the cruiser had already reached destination safely. Others assumed communication systems aboard the vessel were temporarily unavailable. Several routine reporting procedures simply failed to trigger the level of concern required for rapid investigation. Meanwhile, hundreds of sailors drifted alone in open water. As details spread publicly after the rescue, outrage began building rapidly. Families demanded answers regarding how an American heavy cruiser carrying nearly 200 men could sink without immediate response. Survivors themselves struggled to understand why rescue had taken so long when they had expected help within hours of the sinking. Inside the Navy, pressure mounted to assign responsibility. Attention soon focused on Captain Charles McVeigh. Although many officers privately acknowledged broader communication failures contributed heavily to the disaster, McVeigh faced scrutiny regarding tactical decisions made before the attack, particularly whether Indianapolis had maintained sufficient zigzag maneuvering against submarine threats during nighttime transit. The issue became controversial almost immediately. Some naval commanders argued continuous zigzag patterns may have reduced torpedo targeting effectiveness. Others countered that visibility conditions, operational judgment, and broader strategic assumptions regarding reduced Japanese submarine capability shaped those decisions under standard wartime practice. Survivors themselves remained divided. Several crew members defended McVeigh publicly, arguing the sinking occurred too rapidly for meaningful evasive action once I-58 fired. Others believed different precautions might have altered the outcome. The Navy ultimately chose to court-martial McVeigh. The decision shocked many officers throughout the service. It became one of the few instances during World War II in which an American captain faced formal prosecution after losing a ship to enemy action. Even more controversial was the appearance of Japanese submarine commander Mochitsura Hashimoto during proceedings related to the case. Hashimoto testified regarding the attack itself. His statements complicated the Navy's argument significantly. The submarine commander later indicated he believed Indianapolis likely would have been vulnerable regardless of zigzag patterns under existing nighttime conditions. Despite this, McVeigh was convicted for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag continuously. For many survivors, the verdict felt deeply unfair. Over time, criticism of the Navy's handling of the disaster intensified. Historians, former crew members, and military analysts increasingly argued that systemic reporting failures, not solely tactical decisions aboard Indianapolis, played central roles in the scale of loss following the sinking. But by then, the damage extended far beyond official findings. Survivors returned home carrying memories of 4 days in open water that many struggled to discuss for decades. Nightmares, guilt, and psychological trauma followed countless men long after the war ended. Some avoided reunions entirely. Others spent years attempting to reconstruct fragmented memories shaped by exhaustion, hallucinations, and fear. Captain McVeigh himself never fully escaped public blame, and as years passed, the story of USS Indianapolis transformed from wartime disaster into something larger, a symbol of catastrophic failure inside one of the most powerful military systems on Earth. But for the men who survived the Pacific, the disaster was never really about bureaucracy, courts, or naval procedure. It was about the days they spent alone in the water waiting for rescue that never came. In the weeks following the rescue, surviving crew members of USS Indianapolis were dispersed across hospitals, naval stations, and recovery facilities throughout the Pacific. Many arrived in severe physical condition. Prolonged dehydration had damaged kidneys and internal organs. Salt exposure caused infections across open wounds and burns sustained during the sinking. Several survivors remained unable to walk without assistance after spending nearly 4 days floating in open water beneath intense heat and exposure. But the psychological effects proved far more difficult to treat. For many sailors, memories of the Pacific returned repeatedly long after the war ended. Survivors described waking suddenly during the night, convinced they were still drifting in darkness beside scattered groups of men calling for help across the water. Others struggled with survivors' guilt after watching friends disappear during shark attacks, dehydration, or exhaustion while they themselves remained alive. Some rarely spoke about the sinking publicly for decades. Even among family members, many veterans avoided discussing details entirely. The scale of death surrounding USS Indianapolis remained almost impossible to process fully. Of the nearly 100 men aboard the cruiser when it departed Guam, only 316 survived. More than 800 sailors died either during the sinking or in the days that followed. For the United States Navy, the disaster became one of the deadliest losses of life at sea in American military history. Yet the sinking itself occurred during the closing weeks of World War II, at a moment when global attention shifted rapidly toward the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed shortly afterward by Japan's surrender. Massive geopolitical events quickly dominated public focus across the United States. As a result, the story of Indianapolis never received the same immediate recognition as many other wartime disasters. Among survivors, however, the memory remained permanent. Annual reunions eventually brought former crew members together to reconstruct timelines, compare memories, and preserve the identities of those who never returned. Many spent years locating families of lost sailors or documenting individual stories from the sinking itself. Over time, growing numbers of historians and naval analysts re-examined the Navy's handling of the disaster. Questions surrounding Captain Charles McVeigh became central to those debates. Critics increasingly argued that McVeigh had been unfairly blamed for failures extending far beyond decisions made aboard the cruiser during its final hours. Survivors themselves repeatedly defended their captain, insisting systemic communication breakdowns played a far greater role in the scale of loss than zigzag maneuvering procedures debated during the court-martial. Decades later, pressure for formal reconsideration intensified. Former crew members organized campaigns demanding McVeigh's name be cleared. Historians presented evidence highlighting reporting failures inside Navy command structures. Public awareness surrounding the disaster gradually expanded through books, interviews, documentaries, and survivor testimony recorded before aging crew members passed away. Eventually, the Navy reassessed portions of the case. In 2000, the United States Congress passed a resolution effectively clearing Captain McVeigh of responsibility related to the sinking. The decision came decades after the war itself had ended, and decades after McVeigh's death. For many survivors, the reversal arrived too late, but it represented acknowledgement that the disaster surrounding Indianapolis could not be reduced to a single tactical decision made during one night in the Pacific. The wreck itself remained missing for generations. The Philippine Sea covered enormous depths across the cruiser's final location. Multiple search efforts failed to locate the remains of the ship despite advances in underwater technology and historical research. Then in 2017, an expedition funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen identified the wreck nearly 18,000 feet below the surface. Images from the discovery revealed scattered sections of the cruiser resting silently across the ocean floor after more than 70 years underwater. For surviving crew members and families of the dead, the discovery carried emotional weight far beyond historical curiosity. It confirmed the final resting place of hundreds of sailors whose last moments had vanished into darkness beneath the Pacific in 1945. The sinking of USS Indianapolis lasted 12 minutes. The suffering that followed lasted 4 days. But for many who survived, the Pacific never truly let them go. The sinking of USS Indianapolis lasted only 12 minutes. What followed lasted 4 days. For the men left drifting in the Pacific, survival depended on luck, endurance, and whether rescue arrived before the ocean claimed them first. Of the nearly 200 sailors aboard the cruiser, only 316 survived. And even decades later, many survivors admitted the war never truly ended for them after those days in the water.